Good morning. Our first reading this morning is something that's been sitting in my inbox for 2.5 years, sent to me by Nyla Francis, a poem by Rosemary Watola Trummer called Into the Questions. Don't stop me if I've read this before. I feel like I've read it before, but I wasn't able to find anywhere that I did. But it landed well as I sat with it again this week. Into the Questions. I needed today the soft voice of the man from Bethlehem saying, "Put yourself in the pain of others, not in their shoes, but in their pain." I needed to see his eyes when he said, "It is olive picking season, and the families are too afraid to go to the orchards. I needed to hear, "It is the hardest his life has ever been." Needed to hear his fear, his anger, his willingness to wonder again and again, what does it mean to love your enemy? I needed to see the open faith of the man in Israel as he listened, needed to hear his gentle tone as he rejected the phrase, us versus them. Needed to hear the resolve in his voice as he called for creating an us together. And because in the arms of terror, these two men find ways to love, I invite a war into my heart and imagine myself on both sides. Imagine the ache that fuels the rage. I don't have to imagine fear, distrust. It is in all of us, this war, not somewhere far away. It is for all of us to ask in every interface, how do I love my enemy? How do we become an us? Our Bible reading this morning is a brief reading from the book of Acts. This is part of the larger Pentecost story, and it's about some of the world's very earliest socialists. Acts 2:42 to 47. And this is as people are converting and joining the Jesus movement in Jerusalem. And it says, "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. All who believed were together and held all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved." Aziz Abu Sarah was 7 or 8 years old the first time he was shot at. He was a Palestinian child living under occupation. He was accustomed already at that age to passing through checkpoints and getting frisked. When he was 9 or maybe 10, his older brother was arrested by the Israeli military for allegedly throwing stones at soldiers. He was taken, he was 18, maybe 19. He was taken to a military prison where he was held for 10 months and tortured. When they finally released him to his family, the family rushed him to the hospital where he died from his injuries. Maybe you can imagine the level of rage that Aziz carried with him through his childhood, that shaped his outlook, maybe all of his interactions, that flowed like plasma through his blood. And then, as a young man, he went to a school called an ulpan, which is a school that is meant for intensive Hebrew language and culture lessons. His Hebrew teacher was a Jewish Israeli woman, and his time studying with her was transformative. He says, It was the first time somebody reached out to me. It was the first time someone Israeli Jewish who treated me truly like a human being saw me as an equal. And so it stuck with me that I want to do the same. People, I think, don't realize one small action, one kind word, you never leave the person you meet the same after you've interacted with them. Mao's Inon's pain was more recent. On October 7, 2023, his parents, Bilhah and Yakovi, were among the 1,200 Jewish people murdered by Hamas. Maoz and his siblings followed the Jewish custom of sitting Shiva together in their home for 7 days. It was on the second day of that intensive mourning period that the youngest sibling, Magen, came to the rest and asked them to make a decision. He asked them to decide together that they would not seek revenge. His argument, as Maoz expressed it in an interview, his argument was that by revenging the death of our parents, we are not going to bring them back to life. That's it. They are dead. And by avenging their deaths, we are only going to escalate the cycle of bloodshed, of pain, of suffering that we Palestinians and Israelis have been trapped within for a century. In the heat of that moment, when the overwhelming public sentiment in Israel was a response of rage, it would have been easy for a family to call for revenge, to join the calls for revenge. But they knew what Israel's retaliation was going to look like. They knew the level of destruction that would crush Gaza, and they knew that none of it would bring true security or revive those who were dead. So they agreed. And as the eldest brother, it fell to Maoz to make a public statement on their behalf, that they wanted to seek peace instead of revenge. It was that statement that led the Palestinian Aziz Abu Sarah to reach out to him. Maybe some of you heard this on Fresh Air a couple of weeks ago. April 16th, it aired. If you didn't hear it, it's worth going back and listening to the whole conversation. There are world historical moments that I want to think of this morning as spirit moments. I think, for instance, of November 9, 1989, I was in high school. What a conversation that was in my 10th grade German class. I was in my 4th year of learning German at that point. I still have a few words banging around in here somewhere. The first 3 years had all involved an understanding of the physical and psychological terror of the Berlin Wall that separated East from West. And then it was down. My German teacher said to us that day, remember this date. This is significant. Maybe the most significant thing in our lives to that point. I don't know. It was an uprising that had been a long time in the making. It was brought about by some combination of outside political pressure and economic pressure, but also the disciplined organizing of nonviolent activists. The longings of the human heart to overcome the barriers that separate neighbor from neighbor, a spirit moment. I think, for instance, of the civil rights movement, of organizers and marchers and everyday people who knew that they would face violence for their activism, but also knew that they would face violence for the lack of their activism or in the lack of their activism, and who decided that facing the violence strategically with news cameras showing to put the bloodshed in front of a complacent nation was the best option for change. And that sacrifice gave rise to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Spirit moments. I think, for instance, of the Jesus movement that coalesced in those first years and decades after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. People living under occupation, under the conditions of empire and its violence and threats of violence. People who felt compelled into solidarity with each other across the divisions of sect and class, later across the divisions of race and ethnicity. People who, according to our Bible story, started a proto-socialist cult in Jerusalem. I say that mostly as a joke. The model of communal ownership of all things didn't last, and it wasn't the model followed by all of the Jesus movement communities. But the impulse for mutual aid and support is one that was persistent and one that actively drew people into the movement. It's definitely worth paying attention to. It's also worth paying attention to the other practices that were named as a part of this. Brief reading. Paying attention to a set of teachings, wrestling with them together. Making sure to get together and be in each other's company on the regular. Eating together. Maybe it was the first Sunday on the third Tuesday of every month. I don't know. And being vulnerable with each other in prayer. All three of these examples, Berlin, civil rights movement, the early Jesus movement, in all three of them, mutual aid and care is a part of the Spirit moment. And so is the discipline and practice of being in relationship with each other. In fact, we might go so far as to say that about all of these Spirit moments, that the ground zero for them is people being in the kind of relationship with each other that requires them to see that their well-being is connected to the well-being of their neighbors. Maybe we'll see that more clearly or most clearly when we remember that the word spirit is translated from the same word that means breath. I breathe easier when you breathe easier, and vice versa. The recognition of shared interest is the starting point for spirit moments. Or as we put it in our baptismal and our membership vows, some of you will say this with me. I belong to you. Wait, I've done that wrong. You belong to us. We belong to you. Along with the entire universe, we all belong to God. Oh man, I just had a memory of the time in my first congregation when I blanked out on the Lord's Prayer during communion. Maybe this is the place to recognize and acknowledge that the spirit moments that I've named, again, Berlin, civil rights, even early Jesus movement, they haven't had permanent or all-encompassing effects. The Berlin Wall fell, the Iron Curtain came unparted, the Soviet Union broke up, but we all know what Vladimir Putin has been up to in Ukraine and the rest of the region. The Supreme Court has undone key parts of the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Acts. Racism and white supremacy are still around and prouder than ever, actually. And surveying American Christianity might just make Jesus want to walk back into the tomb, pull the stone in front, and lie down for a good long nap. But human cussedness does not undo the preciousness and the wonder of these moments when spirit coalesces into powerful action. It doesn't mean that spirit isn't always and ever beckoning us into our better selves. These moments give us glimpses into the world that can be. So imagine the world of possibility that opened up in first century Jerusalem when that fledgling Jesus movement was taking in new followers, and they all had all things in common and would sell their possessions and goods to distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. I will confess I have always read this and focused on the power of economic sharing and generosity. And don't get me wrong, that's part of it, especially as we wrap up a pledge season and I see some of the stewardship folks here in the sanctuary. I'm not discounting the power of generosity or wanting to short sell that. But that kind of generosity, it does not happen unless there's already been a recognition that this community is worth it, and that the possibilities that it holds are necessary. This was a revolution of the heart before it was a revolution of the purse. Imagine people living under occupation and the threat of violence. When they held all things in common, what were they holding? Their stuff, sure, but what else? Their sense of vulnerability, their fragility, their shared sense of what it means to be human and to be in relationship with one another, the joy, the pain, the hope, the need, the grief. They held their grief in common. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. At first, it was among the occupied peoples, but soon enough, the model of their community was attracting people from the dominant culture too, because that kind of relationship building prepares the ground for spirit moments. As Mao's Inon lived in the raw grief of losing his parents, he had a powerful vision one night. This is how he described it on Fresh Air. He said, "I received a vision as I was crying in bed at night. And I was crying so much. I'm crying very easily. So as I was lying in bed crying, and my entire body suddenly was in pain that I never witnessed before. And through my tears, I could see the entire humanity crying with me. And our tears went down our bodies, and our tears healed the wounds, healed the burns. And as our tears were washing our bodies and healing it, they started going down to earth, and the earth in my vision was soaked with blood. We could not see the grass. We could not see flowers or sand, only blood. And then as we cried and cried, our tears start washing the blood away, purifying the land." And it was only hours after that vision that he received a message from Aziz Abu Sarah, who had been so moved by his statement against revenge and who recognized in him a kindred spirit. They connected, they developed a bond, they call each other brothers now. Eventually they rented a van and they spent 8 days traveling across the Holy Land. They went together, Israeli and Palestinian, Muslim and Jew, through security checkpoints, through the holy cities, through refugee camps, through the walls that separate neighbor from neighbor. At one point, they visited the grave of Mao's grandmother, where the Muslim Aziz followed the Jewish practice of putting on a stone in remembrance. They've put all of this trip together in a new book called The Future is Peace, a shared journey across the Holy Land. And maybe it will do nothing. Israel has killed more than 75,000 Palestinians because it mislabeled its grief as revenge. There are generations of Palestinians who will also be looking to do the same. But Mao's Inon and Aziz Abu Sarah have joined decades of peace activists who know that peace is a choice. They have held all things in common, including their loss, including their grief, including their tears, including the spirit that is their shared breath. And they, like so many others, have opened the way to new, healthy, holistic forms of community. The ground is being tilled, the spirit is ready to move, is moving. The grief is their grief is your grief, is my grief, is our grief, and maybe somehow in that we are saved. This is God's good news. Amen.